Welcome to Steady Badge's Stories. I'm glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, whether it's your car somewhere on the 401 or your kitchen while the kettle boils, this one is going to stay with you. Before we begin, hit like if these stories mean something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment letting me know where in Canada you're tuning in from. Now, let me tell you about a woman nobody at Harbour Ridge Regional Medical Center had bothered to actually see in 4 years. Halifax doesn't look like a city that keeps secrets. Its waterfront stretches wide and gray-green in the mornings, old stone buildings catching their reflections in the harbor. The kind of postcard quiet that makes visitors assume the most dramatic thing that happens here is a foghorn at 3 a.m. Harbour Ridge Regional Medical Center sat 12 minutes from the waterfront by bus. A mid-sized trauma center busy enough to matter, practical enough that nobody lingered past their shift without a good reason. Faye Callahan had chosen it carefully. Not Halifax specifically. The kind of hospital Halifax had, busy, underfunded, perpetually understaffed, the sort of place where a competent nurse who kept her head down could disappear into the rotation without attracting a second glance. She had arrived 4 years ago with a reference letter from a community health clinic in Manitoba, a social insurance number that was entirely legitimate, and a particular quality of quietness that other people read as shyness and she read as survival. She wore royal blue scrubs 1 size too large. She kept her hair back in a knot so unremarkable it seemed designed to discourage description. She took the overnight shifts other nurses avoided, the ones where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the hallways smelled like old coffee and floor wax. She let Dr. Craig Bellamy finish his sentences even when he interrupted hers. She apologized for mistakes she hadn't made. She looked at the floor when she needed to seem harmless and kept her expression patient when she needed to seem dim. Nobody noticed the pale ridge of scar tissue above her right brow. Nobody noticed the way her eyes mapped a room before her feet crossed the threshold. Nobody noticed that when the trauma bays got loud, shouting, alarms, the controlled chaos of a body failing in real time, she was the only one whose breathing didn't change. She had picked Faye because it sounded like a woman who taught piano lessons. She had picked Callahan because it was common enough to blur into background noise. She had picked Halifax because it was far from the base in Trenton, far from anyone who had known her by any name other than what she appeared to be now, a nurse who was easy to overlook. For 4 years, being overlooked had kept her safe. Dr. Bellamy made a habit of correcting people publicly, the way some men collect watches, deliberately and always for an audience. That Wednesday morning, the audience was a cluster of residents on rounds, and the correction was aimed at Faye. "Callahan," he said, loud enough to reach the nurse's station 20 feet behind him. "I need you to redocument the fluid intake on Mr. Arsenault in Bay 3. It's incomplete." He delivered it with the particular tone of a man who wanted everyone nearby to understand that incompleteness was her default state. The documentation was not incomplete. She had charted every measurement herself, double-checked before the shift handover. But arguing meant explaining how she knew. Explaining meant attention. Attention was the one thing Faye Callahan could not afford. "Of course," she said, "I'll take care of it." He had built his entire reputation on the confidence that preceded competence, and in 4 years she had watched him mistake that confidence for wisdom in himself, and mistake quietness for weakness in everyone else. Nurses who pushed back on his decisions found their schedules quietly rearranged. Nurses who agreed with everything found themselves mentioned favorably in administration emails they were never copied on. Faye had learned within her first month which category kept her invisible. She had stayed in it ever since. Later, alone in the supply closet with the door closed, she let herself breathe. Not the slow, controlled breath she used in the hallways. The real kind, the one that reached all the way down. The fluorescent tube above her flickered at the same frequency it always had. The same low hum she had trained herself to tune out the way she had once tuned out the percussion of rotors overhead. Radio chatter layering over itself, the particular silence right before a landing zone got complicated. She had been good at that work. Better than good if she was honest with herself in the 2 or 3 seconds per shift when she allowed honesty. The kind of person other operators trusted in the worst moments of their worst days. The kind whose hands didn't hesitate when hesitation cost lives. She was a nurse now. She looked at the floor. She redocumented charts that didn't need correcting. She straightened her badge and walked back onto the floor before anyone noticed she had been gone. By the time the overnight shift crossed into its 3rd hour, the trauma bay had settled into its usual rhythm. A construction worker with a fractured radius, an elderly woman from Dartmouth with chest pain that turned out to be muscular, a teenager from the peninsula who had collided with a pickup truck on his bicycle and was lucky enough to know it. Faye moved through all of it with an efficiency that people mistook for simply being good at the job, because it was safer to be mistaken for that than for what it actually was. The radio at the charge desk crackled at 11:58 p.m. Incoming trauma, multiple injuries, GSW and blunt force. ETA 6 minutes, patient flagged as priority federal transport. Escorts in communication with charge nurse only. Bellamy materialized beside the trauma bay entrance the way he always did when something important was arriving. Coat smoothed, position claimed at the head of the incoming bay, already composing the version of events where he would be the most necessary person in the room. Faye took her position at the side without being asked. She always did. Outside, November rain had turned the ambulance bay into a wash of red and blue light on black pavement. The rig came in faster than protocol suggested, which told her something about the patient's condition that the radio had not. The rear doors burst open before the vehicle had fully stopped. The man on the stretcher was somewhere in his early 60s, broad-shouldered even in his current state, a shrapnel burn scoring the left side of his face, and a field dressing pressed against his right side that had done its job getting him here, and not much beyond. His jacket had been cut away, military issue beneath it, the collar insignia still visible to anyone who knew what to look for. 2 escorts flanked the stretcher, moving with the particular economy of people trained to cover ground and cover threats at the same time. They were not hospital security. They were not RCMP. Whatever they were, they had assessed every doorway in the trauma bay before the stretcher cleared the threshold. Bellamy stepped forward, voice raised into what he believed was calm authority. He began calling out orders the way a man reads from a script he has rehearsed without understanding. Then the patient opened his eyes. They were dark gray, sharp despite the blood loss, despite the oxygen mask fogging with every labored breath. They swept the room in a single practiced pass, exits, faces, threat levels, and landed on Faye. For 1 full second, nobody in the trauma bay moved. His right hand lifted off the stretcher. Weak, deliberate, one finger extended directly toward her. "Raven," he said, and the word cracked through the oxygen mask with a force that had no business existing in a man losing that much blood. "I want Raven. No one else touches me." The name detonated in the room. Bellamy froze mid-sentence. The 2 escorts turned their heads toward Faye, with the speed of people who had recognized something the rest of the room couldn't yet name. The monitors kept alarming. Someone's radio kept buzzing. And Faye Callahan stood completely still, feeling 4 years of careful, deliberate invisibility collapse in the space of a single word she had not heard spoken aloud since she left Trenton. She knew that voice. She had heard it once, years ago, in the gray pre-dawn of a forward operating base in a country whose name she had signed papers agreeing never to discuss in public. Through static and rotor wash and the particular ringing that followed an explosion too close to the landing zone, the voice of a man who had looked at her, bloodied, exhausted, 26 years old, and already certain she would not leave that compound, the same person who had arrived, and told her she was the finest extraction medic he had encountered in 30 years of operational service. Brigadier General Aldrich Severn, retired officially, still very much in demand by people who needed things done without paper trails. She had never expected him to follow her here. She had never expected anyone to follow her here. Bellamy opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but the monitors cut him off. Severn's oxygen saturation had begun dropping, not gradually the way blood loss dropped it, but steeply, plummeting in a way that had nothing to do with the wound in his side, and everything to do with something building silently inside his chest. His breathing changed, shallow then labored, his lips beginning to shade towards gray beneath the mask. Faye's eyes moved from the monitor to his chest, to the asymmetry now visible in how it rose. One side moving less than the other, the veins in his neck beginning to stand against his skin. Every instinct she had spent 4 years burying surfaced in a single clear, unavoidable signal. Tension pneumothorax. Air had breached the chest wall, likely from the same impact that had produced the field dressing, and was now trapped, building pressure with every breath he took. Not contained. Compressing. Pushing against his heart, against the great vessels, squeezing them toward the point where circulation would simply stop. Without intervention in the next 60 seconds, it would not matter what else anyone in that room did. The procedure is called needle decompression. A large bore needle inserted at a specific anatomical landmark, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just above the 3rd rib to protect the vessels and nerves running beneath, allows the trapped air to escape in an immediate, audible release of pressure. It requires precise positioning, a steady hand, and the willingness to act before the window closes. It is taught in advanced trauma curricula, in paramedic training, and in the combat medic courses run for Canadian Armed Forces personnel deploying to high-risk environments. Performed correctly, it buys enough time to place a formal chest tube and let medicine finish what emergency instinct started. Every second of delay narrows that window further. Bellamy shouted for a crash cart. His voice had climbed into a pitch that created noise instead of action. the kind of shouting that happens when a man's confidence has outpaced his preparation. A resident began reaching for the defibrillator. Wrong tool, wrong instinct. A second nurse scrambled for the phone to page the on-call surgeon, her voice rising above the alarms. None of it would reach Severn in time. Faye moved past Bellamy without asking. Her hands found the equipment tray. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower than anything that Trauma Bay had heard from her in 4 years. Not quieter, but different. The register of someone issuing information rather than requesting permission. Tension pneumo right side, he needs decompression now or we lose him. No question in her voice, no apology, no deference. Just the specific, unambiguous certainty of someone who had said these words before in worse circumstances and been right every time. Bellamy opened his mouth. The taller of the two escorts, a man with the jaw of someone who had been hit by things and not moved, and the eyes of someone who spent his professional life evaluating people for one quality only, stepped forward and said 2 words. Let her. His name was Rafferty. Nobody in that room knew it yet, but the weight those 2 words carried made every argument Bellamy had been forming dissolve before it reached the air. Faye located the landmark on Severn's chest with fingers that moved quickly but never rushed, prepped the site, positioned the needle at the exact angle that had been drilled into her body long before she ever wore a nursing badge. She inserted it. The hiss was immediate, a sharp, unmistakable release of trapped pressure, air escaping the way it should have been able to escape all along. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation stopped falling, then it began to climb. Severn's color returned in the time it took the room to exhale. His breathing eased from desperate to controlled. The alarm quieted into the steady rhythm of a heart that was no longer fighting against something crushing it from the outside. 3 full seconds of silence. Then Rafferty stepped closer, studying her hands with the focused attention of a man conducting an assessment, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Those are not a nurse's hands. That is combat training." Faye's pulse was loud in her own ears. There was no version of tonight that ended with her walking back into invisibility. She understood that now, clearly and completely, the way she understood things when the adrenaline stripped everything non-essential away and left only what was true. She kept working, stabilized the site, monitored vitals, let her hands do what her hands had always known how to do, even through 4 years of pretending otherwise. Severn's eyes opened again, weaker now, sedation beginning to take hold, but locked on her with a deliberate clarity. "Told them," he whispered, said only Raven, nobody else. Behind her, she heard Bellamy murmur something to the charge nurse. Something about who, exactly, Faye Callahan really was. And for the first time in 4 years, she didn't feel the impulse to make the answer disappear before anyone could hear it. Director Colleen Mercer arrived in the hallway outside the trauma bay, 40 minutes later, flanked by the hospital's legal coordinator, and an expression carefully arranged to suggest calm authority while communicating something closer to damage control. "Miss Callahan," she said. She had always called her Miss Callahan rather than Nurse Callahan, the small linguistic distance of a woman who thought of nurses as administrative resources. "You performed an invasive procedure without a physician order, without documented certification on file, and without following the established escalation protocol." "I performed a needle decompression on a patient in tension pneumothorax," Faye said. Without it, he would have gone into cardiac arrest before Dr. Bellamy finished reading the monitor. "That determination is not within your scope." It was the only determination that mattered in that room. Before Mercer could press the silence into something official, Rafferty appeared at the end of the corridor. He was unhurried. He was also completely impossible to ignore, in the way certain people become when they have spent enough years in rooms where ignoring them was dangerous. "Director," he said, voice carrying no particular aggression and therefore carrying significantly more weight than aggression would have. "We've confirmed that at least 2 individuals connected to the attack on Brigadier General Severn are within 4 kilometers of this building. One of them attempted to access his patient records at your front desk 90 minutes ago. Your hospital security is not equipped for what may be arriving here in the next 45 minutes. The only person in this building with the relevant training to help manage that situation is the nurse you just suspended." Mercer looked at the legal coordinator, who had stopped writing anything. "I'm reinstating her," Mercer said, in the voice of someone making a decision they have decided to frame as their own, temporarily. "Of course," Rafferty said, already turning back down the corridor. The other escort, younger, quieter, the kind of stillness that read less like calm and more like readiness, relayed what had come through on his radio. 2 men matching the description from the front desk had been spotted near the east parking structure. A 3rd vehicle had circled the block twice. RCMP was occupied with a separate incident in the north end. Federal backup was 45 minutes out. 45 minutes is a long time inside a building, he said, His name was Slade. He said it the way people say things they have already made peace with. Faye let the part of her brain she had been sitting on for 4 years wake up completely. She began mapping the hospital the way she had once mapped terrain before insertions. Not the official floor plan, the real one. The one she carried in her body after 4 years of overnight shifts. She knew where the service elevators stuck, where the corridor lighting had dead zones, which fire doors could be triggered from the maintenance panel on sublevel 2, and how the rear loading corridor connected 3 wings of the building without passing through a single public space. 4 years of being invisible here had given her something no briefing document could replicate. A working, breathing knowledge of every seam in the building's defenses. "We need to move him," she said, her voice carrying the authority back into it that she had spent 4 years suppressing. "Not to another patient room. To a position we can actually defend. 1 entrance, reinforced walls, no exterior windows, close enough to the surgical suite to escalate medically if we have to." Rafferty studied her. Something in his expression had shifted from the wariness of a man evaluating an unknown variable to the recognition of a man who had found an unexpected asset. "Where?" he said. "Old record storage behind the imaging wing. Single reinforced door. The room held physical chart archives before the system went digital. No windows face each side. It connects to the service corridor that runs the full length of the building, which gives us both an exit route and a choke point. I have walked past that room every shift for 4 years." Slade exchanged a look with Rafferty, the specific look of 2 people deciding how much trust to extend and landing on. Enough. "Lead the way," Rafferty said. For the first time since she had walked into Harbour Ridge Regional Medical Center, someone followed her instead of the other way around. They moved Severn quietly. Infection control precaution was the language Faye used with the skeleton crew she trusted with the transfer. Bland enough that no one panicked, specific enough that no one questioned it twice. Bellamy was still in the trauma bay when she gave the instructions. He did not object. Something about the last hour had recalibrated what he understood about Faye Callahan, and the recalibration had not yet finished. The records room, converted into a temporary bay in under 12 minutes, was cramped and deliberately functional. Monitors connected, IV line checked. Slade positioned himself at the junction, where the service corridor split towards the loading dock. The most likely approach route for anyone who had done basic reconnaissance on the building. Faye checked Severn's vitals one final time before stepping out to help coordinate the perimeter. His oxygen held, his color was good. "You found me anyway," she said very quietly to the sedated man who couldn't hear her. "After everything I did to disappear, you still found me." The first sign came through Slade's radio feed. 3 individuals moving on foot from the parking structure toward the east loading dock entrance. Coordinated movement, faces obscured, the spacing between them that existed because someone had trained them to move that way. "They're coming through the dock," Faye said into the radio Rafferty had handed her. Her voice fell into the same cadence she had used in places far from any hospital. "Slade, hold the junction. Rafferty, seal the corridor behind the room. I'll slow them before they reach the door." "You're not engaging them directly," Rafferty said immediately. "I know this hospital better than they do. That's the entire advantage." She was already moving. "I'm going to use it." She found the maintenance panel on sublevel 1 and cut the corridor lighting in the east service wing to 30%. Navigable if you knew the layout. Confusing enough to cost precious minutes if you didn't. She triggered a fire door alarm 2 corridors east of the records room. Noise, light, motion sensor activation. Enough to pull attention towards a false signal while the real approach adjusted. She used the automatic doors on the sublevel stairwell, triggered them from outside to produce exactly the kind of sound and motion that pulled the first intruder's flashlight beam in the wrong direction. She watched him curse under his breath, radio something clipped and professional to his partners, and move towards the stairwell, drawn completely away from the corridor that mattered. 1 down. Slade intercepted the second at the junction precisely where Faye had told him to expect it. The engagement was brief, controlled, professional. The brevity of someone who knew what they were doing and had no reason to make it complicated. When RCMP officers arrived to the fire alarm 6 minutes later, they found the second intruder restrained and disarmed, and Slade already on his radio moving to the next position. 2 down. The third, the man in the gray jacket who had asked the intake clerk about a federal transport patient with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before, moved more carefully than the others. He had understood by now that something about the approach was wrong. The lights were wrong. The noise was wrong. The building felt occupied in a way civilian hospitals weren't supposed to feel at midnight. He paused at a junction, listening, his flashlight beam sweeping slowly across walls that offered nothing back. Faye was 12 feet behind him, invisible in the way she had once been invisible in much darker and more demanding environments, breathing slow, watching his movement the way she had once watched patrol patterns in places whose names she had signed papers about. She stepped into the gap in the service corridor and triggered the emergency lighting on the sublevel connecting to the east stairwell. The one that looked, to anyone who didn't know this building, like a direct route to patient areas. To anyone who did know this building, it was a dead end with a security door at the far wall. He moved towards it. Rafferty was waiting at the junction he had no choice but to pass. The confrontation ended in under 2 minutes. No shots fired, no injuries on either side. Just a man face down on a service corridor floor, hands secured, the particular silence of someone trained to give nothing away regardless of circumstance. RCMP emergency response team arrived 11 minutes ahead of the 45-minute window Slade had estimated. They swept the building with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood exactly how close the situation had come to being significantly worse. Inspector Yvonne Gould found Faye near the records room when the sweep was complete. Gould was the kind of tired that lived in the eyes rather than the posture. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing crises since before breakfast and had not found a reason to stop. She asked Faye careful, precise questions in a conference room borrowed from hospital administration. How had she known which corridor to defend? How had she anticipated the approach vectors? How a nurse had coordinated a containment response that ERT would have been satisfied with. "I'm not a civilian," Faye said finally, plainly, the truth she had spent 4 years avoiding. "Not exactly, I just stopped being one of the visible ones." Gould looked at her for a long moment, closed her notebook. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "whatever paperwork exists on your old life isn't going to surface through this. Some things get settled quietly." Faye thanked her. The relief that came with the words was larger than she had expected it to be. By morning, the story had moved through Harbour Ridge the way stories always move through hospitals. In fragments, exaggerated in some versions, understated in others, always circling back to the same undeniable fact. The nurse from Knights had saved a senior military officer, and then kept the building safe while everyone else was still waiting for backup to arrive. A first-year nurse named Addie Fournier brought Faye a coffee at shift change without being asked. Faye accepted it and allowed herself 30 seconds of something resembling peace, and was quietly surprised by how much she had missed the sensation of it. Bellamy's conduct during the incident, his failure to recognize the clinical emergency, the time lost while he reorganized his authority instead of his patient, was reviewed formally by the medical director. He kept his position, but something in the way his colleagues regarded him in the weeks that followed was different from before, a quiet recalibration that no formal process had mandated, and that everyone on the unit understood without discussing. He began asking questions instead of issuing corrections. He stopped raising his voice in the hallways. It was not a transformation, but it was the beginning of something that might eventually deserve the word. Director Mercer reversed the suspension before the review board convened, amending the incident report to reflect what Gould's team had already confirmed, that Faye's actions had not only preserved Severn's life but had materially prevented a targeted attack inside a civilian medical facility. She requested a private meeting with Faye the following week and closed her office door, a gesture she had not once extended in 4 years of Faye's employment. "I made a decision based on liability before I understood the situation," Mercer said. The words cost her something visible. "I'm sorry for that." She did not say it with exactly the words Faye might have expected. But she made certain, in every meeting that followed, that Faye Callahan's clinical judgment was treated with the weight it had earned. Severn was discharged 3 weeks later, walking out under his own strength. He stopped at the nurse's station before his escort moved him toward the waiting vehicle outside, and he took Faye's hand in both of his, in front of colleagues who had finally stopped not seeing her, and said what he had come to say. "You were never hiding weakness," he told her, quietly enough that it was only for her. "You were hiding command. There's a difference. I hope you've finally decided to stop." She watched him go through the sliding doors and out into the December morning, the kind of clear, cold Halifax morning that arrived after a storm system finally broke, the harbor flat and silver and briefly beautiful. The doors slid shut. The ordinary sounds of the hospital resumed around her, a phone ringing at the front desk, monitors cycling through their rhythms, the shuffle of shift change beginning down the corridor. Addie appeared at her elbow, notebook in hand, asking hesitantly whether Faye might have time this week to walk her through chest trauma assessment. She'd heard things, she wanted to learn it properly, not through rumor. Faye looked at the notebook, then at the young nurse holding it with the posture of someone expecting to be declined. "Come find me before your shift tomorrow," she said. "Bring questions." Addie nodded, already writing something down, already taking it seriously. What grew from that conversation was not dramatic and was not announced. It was a standing half-hour before certain shifts at an empty charting station, with a scrap of paper and a pen, lung anatomy drawn in ballpoint. Pressure differentials explained in plain language. The warning signs that mattered described the way they actually presented, not the way textbooks made them sound. Other nurses started showing up, then a resident, then 2 more. Faye never wore the call sign openly again, but she stopped pulling away from it when Rafferty or Slade used it during their visits. Visits that had less and less to do with Severn's recovery and more to do simply with checking in on her. Rafferty mentioned a program once the way he mentioned most things, without pressure, as information rather than invitation. The Canadian forces were working to close the gap between combat medicine and civilian emergency care. Bridge training, no deployment, no tactical operations. Just teaching people on both sides of that divide how to keep each other alive when the ordinary systems weren't fast enough. It needs someone who's lived on both sides of it, he said. That sounds like something worth doing, she admitted. It's something only you could actually do well, he said, which is different. Send me the details, she told him. No promises yet, but send me the details. She walked home along the waterfront that evening, the same route she had walked for 4 years, the harbor flat and cold and gold-edged where the streetlights caught it. For 4 years, she had walked this route with her shoulders braced for the next small humiliation, waiting at the start of the next shift. She walked it now without bracing for anything at all. Somewhere behind her, Harbour Ridge Regional Medical Center continued doing what hospitals do. The sirens, the monitors, the compressed urgency of people trying to keep other people alive in the time available. Changed in the ways that had always mattered more than anything the paperwork would ever record. Because one night, a wounded man had looked across a chaotic trauma bay and said the name of the person he needed most. And the person he needed most had been there the whole time, wearing blue scrubs 1 size too large, keeping her eyes down, waiting to be needed in a way that nobody there had thought to ask for. She had spent 4 years being invisible. She didn't need to be invisible anymore. Thank you for being here with us at Steady Badges Stories. If this one stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar, or made you think of someone who carries more than they show, leave that in the comments below. We read every single one. Hit like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story. It's already waiting.